Welcome to NASCAD Artwork Alumni Talks. My name is Molly Cronin. I'm your host. This week we are meeting with Chris Dorosz and Aralia Maxwell, and we are talking about sculptural painting. But before we begin, I want to acknowledge that NASCAD is on the unceded land of the Mi'kmaq people, the traditional unceded land of the Mi'kmaq people, excuse me. And we are honored to work, speak, gather, teach, and make artwork here. As I said, my name is Molly Cronin. I'm your host, and we're talking about merging the worlds of sculpture and painting this week. So thank you so much to Chris Dorosz, MFA 1996, and Aralia Maxwell 2019 MFA for joining us today. Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Hi. Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. So this is our last artwork of 2023. This is very exciting. But to get us started, I was hoping you guys could tell us a little bit about your time at NASCAD, what you were studying, maybe who you were studying with. Just give us like a little background into your experience at the school.
Aurelia,
Would you like to go first, Chris?
Oh, you can.
Me first? Okay.
Sure.
Well, I arrived at NASCAD as an MFA student in 2017. I came in through the painting department, and I dabbled around. I explored some other areas. I had a lot of great mentors in different departments, including ceramics, jewelry, sculpture. I explored everywhere that I possibly could, but at the end of the day, my home base was always painting. There's like so many people that I could list that helped me along my way, but Sarah Hartland Rowe was a particularly important person to me in my time at NASCAD, as well as Steve Higgins and Rebecca Hennon, Karen Cope. Like across the board, I explored every department.
And I'm a little more ancient. I entered the MFA program in 1995. I still can't believe not much time has passed. And yeah, I don't know if it was structured different, if it's structured differently now, but we chose one person to work with over the 2 years. And I worked with Susie Fennell, the amazing Susie, who I believe is retired now. And we got along like a house on fire. I needed somebody who allowed me to go out of the bounds of conceptual structures. And as you'll see, during the talk with my work, it's all based in studio play. And so the ideas and concepts come out of that. So I just needed a real sort of person that would let me think out of the box, out of the conceptual box, because thinking conceptually can be a box in and of itself. And I had a great thesis committee. So I worked with Suzanne Gauthier and Bruce Barber. I think Alex Livingston, I think he just came on the staff then. It's so long ago, I can't remember if I officially worked with him, but certainly he was a great inspiration and a friend. And Susan McEachern, Jan Peacock, and those are the ones that I can remember. Again, it was so long ago. And yeah, I had a great experience. I focused on painting. I was accepted as a painter. That didn't mean I had to stick with it, but I did. And I came in wanting to stretch the boundaries of what that meant. I established that as a sort of path from my time at Concordia before that. And I can talk about that later, how that transferred over.
Well, it sounds like you guys both had dream teams at your time here. Chris, you spoke about the kind of influence that Susie Fennell had in expanding your horizons in terms of what your practice can look like. And I'm curious if you both had that similar experience at NASCAD where I think thinking outside the box is what NASCAD does really well. And I think the kind of like cross-disciplinary approach is where NASCAD really excels. Did you guys find that was true of your time at NASCAD, and did that help foster this kind of hybrid practice you have now?
Yeah, definitely. I think that the community at NASCAD is so friendly and welcoming. It was so amazing that I could walk into any department and the technicians would help me realize my vision for a painting. Um, there is a lot of room to play at NASCAD. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I my time at Concordia, which was before that, was the early 90s. You know, it was basically still the late 80s. And it was very structured. So as somebody who was taking painting, and I was very interested in printmaking as well, I was not encouraged to mix those two at that time. It was very separate. And, you know, I wanted to make paintings that could be multiples. I wanted to paint in my prints, and I was literally told not to do that by instructors there. But, you know, my instructors at that point were coming out of a different tradition. I think when I was at NASCAD in the 90s, there was sort of a big sort of turnover, this idea of interdisciplinary studies. And yeah, choosing Susie allowed me to work at my own pace. I needed to come to an idea through lots of trial and error. And it allowed me to do that at NASCAD. Unfortunately, I didn't have that for my undergraduate degree. So I was coming at it, and I only had the 2 years for my master's degree to have this milieu. And I looked at the undergrads there with envy, thinking, oh, you have your first year where you can do whatever you want. And then you have 3 more years after that. And yeah, NASCAD, it was a great place. Everyone in my year, we still dream back to what an idyllic time it was. That was
Yeah, and
the benchmark.
to bounce off of that, I think I had a really similar experience. I did my undergrad at the University of Saskatchewan, and I actually did a BA in art history. It was more of a liberal arts experience. So that was a great foundation for me. I was taking poli-sci and geology and all of these different things. So I had that kind of a foundation. But then when I came to NASCAD, it was so exciting to be at a proper art college and art school where you're only surrounded by artists. So I kind of had like a conceptual understanding of concept I wanted to work with. But then when I got to NASCAD, I could really dig into materials and techniques and just be completely immersed amongst artists. That was really special.
Yeah, I think that was the one of the main teaching thrusts that that was at NASCAD, where the approach was the theory. So you figured out what you wanted to do, and then you could learn that approach, and that was part of the theoretical underpinnings of it. Whereas at least from my experience, you were a painter, you learned all of that, and then you figured out sort of what you wanted to paint as a painter. But at NASCAD, you would decide, I want to do this in paint because it means this. And then you would learn how to paint, which has its drawbacks too, right? But it was an interesting approach, which was novel to what I had from Concordia.
Can you guys tell us a little bit about the kind of practice you guys have developed since that time? Like, what is your, we're here to talk about the kind of hybrid of sculpture and painting that you both work on. Can you tell us a little bit about your individual practices? Maybe Aralia, we'll start with you.
Yeah. So I began when I started at NASCAD, I was making two-dimensional oil paintings. They were representational, they were figurative. But then over the course of my 2 years, I was able to develop a new type of practice where I spent a lot of time experimenting with a lot of different materials. And the one that's kind of stuck with me the longest has been this technique of using really thick acrylic paint. I've developed my own recipes. I started doing the testing when I was at NASCAD, and over the years I've perfected the recipe and the technique, but I'm using really thick acrylic paint and using patisserie cooking tools to pipe it and create these really thick sculptural paintings. So I kind of also, I think I have NASCAD to blame for this really process-oriented approach I take, where I set myself rules before I begin, whether it's color, line, gesture. And then I methodically make these works that unfold over time. And they're kind of about an evolution of material and an evolution of aesthetics. And they're these like mutant kind of cake-like looking objects. I hope that explains.
Oh, that's great. And we're going to get into kind of talking more about colors in your work and food, but I want to just give us like a quick overview. So that's perfect.
Sure.
Thank you so much. Chris, what about you? Can you tell us a bit about your practice?
Sure. I can also show pictures at any point too.
Sure.
I don't know if
Feel
you want
free.
that now or later.
I think whenever you feel inclined, if you want to show pictures, go for it.
Just, a picture says 1,000 words, right? So, I was at NASCAD 1995. The big question for me as a painter was, why am I doing this? Like you can create these interesting images in photography and video. I needed to answer that question for myself to move on. And for me, the answer was just to dialogue with technology. There was no answer, but I needed to dialogue with it. So I started thinking not necessarily about pixelation, but painting as an object. With technology, it's all about the image, and it has taken the idea of texture and physicality away. And of course, 30 years later, we're at the end game where we're basically losing our bodies. So that's something I'll come to in a little bit, which is a concern of mine. But I really wanted to deal with the physicality of paint. And I was playing in the studio, taking canvas off stretchers, as we all do, right? And I had this pile of staples. And I just started playing around with them on a surface of a canvas and started filling them with paint. So dealing with paint as having like a physical body and being corralled somehow and getting away from the gestural stroke. So this is one of my thesis pieces. This is called 1347 Bethany Lane. And it's just that. It's made up of staples on a canvas filled with, in this case, enamel. And just to fast forward, here's one that was done 10 years later in the early 2000s. This is called Self-Portrait with Pea Jar. And here's a close-up of what that looks like. So this was sort of my entree into starting to move off the canvas, starting to think about paint as having a physical body, and getting away from the gesture of paint and thinking about paint as a unit. So I've always thought that it could be a metaphor for DNA, and I'll get to that later on with some of my work. In this case, the pixel, slowing down video imagery and monitor imagery. So there's obviously a labor-intensive process in this. So this is probably my biggest one right here. This is in the WAG collection in Winnipeg. It's called St. Jerome in his study. And a lot of my work sort of has a spiritual or religious underpinning. St. Jerome in his study was taken from this little etching by Rembrandt. And I wanted to sort of capture the idea of thought in the background, which this exemplifies. And of course, this is initially an etching. And so I'm mimicking it here with the staples. And it's just staples on a black gesso surface filled with gel medium. So the idea is that it's this visceral experience. It shimmers and undulates as the viewer moves. And just sort of to finish this idea of art as, or painting as the object, I'll just sort of fast forward here. And here's more current work. This is from my Stasis series, where I'm dropping paint drops on vertical acrylic rods. And the imagery is taken from mass media. And it all has to do with sort of the forces that are affecting our lives. So this is from Sun Valley, Idaho, the Billionaires Conference that happens every year, where they basically decide our futures in terms of tech and the economy. And here's a close-up of this. So this is sort of the grandchild, so to speak, of the initial work that I did at NASCAD, working with staples and filling them.
That's an interesting evolution. And I liked what you were saying, Chris, about this way of working being in conversation with technology and the way that our visual culture is shifting. Because for me, I think that beginning to deal with paint sculpturally, it was a way to approach my practice in a more embodied way and to consider paint just purely as a material instead of this expectation that you just smear it on a two-dimensional surface. To really like hone in on what paint is, it's funny that I had to take it to this three-dimensional unexpected place.
I think some of us do, and I think it's just the way we think, you know. I don't know if you sort of have more of a maker mind or an engineer's mind. I know that's partly what I have, this idea of needing to sort of
I just need to know how things work. And a big part of my practice is just being in the studio making. Like I have the conceptual underpinnings, but at the end of the day, what I'm making is just a lot of hours of testing and playing and seeing what the material will do.
Did you guys have any kind of unexpected discoveries or learning curves when you were experimenting with these new ways of working with paint, these kind of embodied practices, as you were talking about, Aralia? Were there particular learning curves or experiments that came out of your early attempts?
I think one of the biggest challenges for me is because I chose to take painting in kind of an unusual direction, and I was building my own personal visual language. Once you start doing that, you're like setting aside some conventions that are quite useful. So like figuring out how to build a composition that isn't on a rectangle or a square sets up a whole new series of problems. Once you move away from a stretcher, there's so many ways you can hang a stretcher on a wall that we just know, we don't think about, just happens. So trying to figure out a support for my paintings that I could hang on a wall and also that it could be flat on a table cleanly and safely, and it wasn't going to fall apart. It was going to be flush against the wall. That took me years to figure out, and I had to work with a lot of people in wood shops to finally figure out a mechanism that worked for me, that I could safely send off to galleries and there wouldn't be any fiddling around with hardware. And once you start changing your visual language, you have to think about every single piece of what a painting is, what an art object is.
Yeah, those complicated install considerations. I hadn't even thought about that, of course.
Just to make it look as seamless as possible. It's tricky.
Yeah, absolutely. Chris, what about you? Were there some learning curves in your experimental phase of this practice?
Yes. That's all there is. And in fact, sometimes, now that it's 30 years on, it's like, why am I doing this all the time? So, like you become known for something. And part of what I'm known for is this innovation with paint. But every single project requires, like Aralia said, sort of inventing it all anew. When you're painting on canvas, that's been established. So I need to think about the venue. So if it's, so for instance, I just showed at the University of Manitoba, and you might get a kick out of this. I'll share the screen. So I recreated a room where famous seances were held in Winnipeg out of paint strokes. So this is like the negative space that's charged with the spirit world. And here's a wider installation, and then here's a close-up. And this I knew wasn't for sale. It was for one showing. If it shows again, great. So I wasn't too concerned about structural integrity, although I needed to get it from my studio to the gallery. But if it's for sale, that's a whole other kettle of fish. It needs to, like Aralia was saying, it needs to be conservation worthy. It needs to transport okay. It needs to have a life. Even with this thing, this is sort of the structure I needed to do to pack it up. So each row had to be threaded open. It's basically, I created a loom. So the paint strokes are hung on fishing line. And so this pole system needed to push everything back. I needed to put paper in between, then push it back. And then the whole thing sort of falls into a box like a wedding dress. Imagine lying a wedding dress very nicely in a long box. So yeah, it takes about 10 years to really perfect an idea. I know that sounds, I don't know, daunting or maybe even depressing, but I notice like every 10 years, it's sort of perfected. But along that timeline, I'm developing other ideas. And I don't know about you, Aurelia, but working this way with paint and experimenting, you probably have 10 ideas that you haven't done yet. And there's just not enough time to sort of work on them. So you do have your future mapped out. Like I'm never worried that there won't be ideas anymore. It's just a matter of finding the time and working out how to execute it. And
no, I'm exactly the same way.
yeah. And you probably have like a really good go-to source of people, like your carpenter, the person that does, like I have a fabricator for my plastic supports. And during the pandemic, I thought they were going to go under, and I almost died because nobody else could do it. It took years to get to the point where they knew what to do.
Yeah, I do rely on a great team of people across Canada and beyond to help me with all my questions or general fabrication. It's important to develop those networks, and it takes time to do that as well as being in the studio.
Yep. In fact, sometimes that's even more of the time. Like I could spend a day making people, stroking them to what I need and doing emails and being on a call with them. And I'm thinking all along, oh, I just like to be in the studio painting. But sometimes that just lasts for weeks trying to get that behind the scenes stuff ready.
But it is so magical when it all comes together.
It is. And
yeah.
It's so important, like people, like it's really about relationships, like you say, that you build, and you can't do it without like a lot of people. It's been humbling. Like as I get older, I realize like I'm really not the artist anymore in a way. It's like a team effort. There's so many people that help me out and have knowledge that I don't have.
Yeah, I love hearing about the kind of underlying collaboration, or the collaboration that we maybe don't always know goes into these kinds of projects. So from your install teams to your fabricators to your colleagues and coworkers. So yeah, it's wonderful to hear about the behind the scenes work a little bit and all the many hands that go into making these beautiful pieces. I was curious to ask you both about the use of color in your work, because we've been talking about material and form, and I think this is also a very significant aspect of both of your works, and Chris, for you also, your teaching. And I was wondering if you could both tell me a little bit about your relationship to color and how it works, how it operates in your practice.
Sure. So for me, I started working with just by kind of found my way into working with like very saturated colors when I started making this work when I was at NASCAD. And then through research, I realized that many of the colors that I was kind of gravitating towards are very modern contemporary colors. They have been invented by chemists within the last 150 years. So they're very new to human beings. We've invented these colors. They include phthalos, azos, quinacridone. And the more I researched these colors, I realized they really played into my understanding of consumer culture. And they're very saturated, they're very poppy, they grab your eye. And I made a choice in the last 5 years to restrict my palette to only these new colors. They're often cheaper than more expensive pigments like an ultramarine that are more historical. But I think it plays into this whole framework that I've been building about how consumer culture has just completely shifted our world today. And yeah, it's a very specific palette, and it speaks to our moment now and how we're hungry for these kind of artificial colors.
Yeah, I feel the same way. You know, initially I I needed to figure out firstly the type of paint I needed to use to do what I wanted. And like Aurelia, you know, acrylic was the go-to simply because it dries fast and there's no shrinkage. And interestingly, conceptually, it's basically plastic, right? Like acrylic is plastic. So um, I I teach color theory, and I was never taught color theory. You know, I got the color wheel. I mean, everyone does a version of the color wheel, but I had no idea to get a bright purple, you needed to mix a cool warm and a warm cool. You can't mix red and blue to get purple. Everybody who tries that gets this brownish color, and they don't know why. Well, it's because of temperature effects and all of that. So when I started teaching color theory in San Francisco, so I live between here and San Francisco, and I started teaching 20 some years ago. I was learning just as much as I was teaching. And I realized, oh my God, this is what I needed to do the work that I'm doing. So yes, I would call my color palette process color as well. And if you just think of a color photocopy, if you used to be able to see the photocopier do a layer of cyan, a layer of yellow, a layer of magenta. And if you do those enough, you get black. The CMYK, the K part is the black, which just sort of speeds up the process. So most of my work, I start with a mid-tone. And for me, I like purple. And then I do my yellow. And then I do my magenta and my blue. And then I pick a color that summarizes what I need. So you can get any value through a mixture of CMY, but you might, and you get sort of the rough temperature and maybe saturation level, because you can desaturate something by mixing temperatures, but you might not get that really specific color that you want. So my last layer is always like a situating color on top. And what I try and achieve is media color. So I always work from photocopies of things, photocopies off of the internet, or it used to be from newspapers. And I want to achieve that sort of quality of the color with the grain. But I'm with Aurelia too. I work with bright colors to achieve that because it is about optical mixing. So there's lots of little bits of something. If I work with those muted colors right away, I get sort of a flat result. Like I am aiming for like a wall presence. My work is very subtle and ephemeral, And I don't need the color to be that as well. From a distance, it becomes that, but from up close, it's this added valueness where there's this pop. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's funny how similar our way to coming towards color has been. Because I also found that when I started, I made the switch from oil to acrylic because that was the material that gave me the surface that I was after with that thick paint. Then these saturated colors quickly followed. And I also will add that this past fall, I've been back at NASCAD teaching a painting class, and we spent a lot of time digging into the history of pigments and what each pigment, like where it comes from, what time period it's from, and what the benefits of each pigment will be, which is something I personally didn't get in my undergrad. And I've learned a lot through teaching what pigments and colors can offer students in the same way that you have, it sounds like.
Well, it's funny because like color theory, I liken it to ping pong, right? Everyone thinks they can play ping pong until they see like a pro who might be like in the Olympics playing, and it's like, oh, there's much more to it, right? And yeah, I think it's just we always, I don't know if it's this art thing where, well, we could talk for hours. I'm sure you know the history of how color was always seen as something vulgar and something to be mistrusted. So that's why all those merchants in 17th century paintings are wearing neutral colors, blacks and grays. It's an idea of seriousness. Wearing bright yellow, you would just be like on the fringes of society, right? And just go to any art opening, right? Most people are wearing their neutrals. We distrust color, and we don't not only study it, but revel in it, says the man wearing black today. But I'm wearing it so I pop against my my red background. But yeah, no, and I felt super guilty. I don't know about you, but making that switch from oil to acrylic, like I was just hanging on to dear life, thinking, I love oil, I love oil, I love oil. I don't want to leave it, but it just was not going to give me what I needed.
I
And
also felt that. I felt
yeah,
so guilty.
I was hanging on, hanging on, hanging on, and finally I let go. And I'm
Yeah.
even, my staple colors, those process colors that I use before that final layer, not only are they bright and they're acrylic, I actually use neon. I use the fluorescent, um, what is it, Blick. I use Blick brand out of the US. Yeah.
I've also found that by limiting my palette to these specific colors, it's given me more freedom to play with the form and the shape.
Mhm.
I found that I was getting really distracted if I could use every paint color in the paint
Yeah.
box.
And you don't
It
need
just
it.
kind of complicated things. And when I distilled it to the specific palette, then I could really push the other areas. And I think my work got a lot stronger.
Yeah. Well, the
Yeah,
way I
'cause
teach color theory, you only need 6 colors. You need 2 reds, 2 yellows, 2 blues, a cool and a warm version of each, and white and black. And you can make every color under the sky. Simple.
Chris, you also write with, I believe you wrote a textbook on color theory, correct? And you talk about
Yeah. Oh,
color theory applied to like specific disciplines.
it's in
Can you
pieces
tell us
here,
a bit about
but
that? Oh yeah, gorgeous.
well, yes, I teach at an applied art school. So if you want to learn how to make rock videos, or you want to show at New York Fashion Week, you would come to the Academy of Art and study. We do have fine arts too, but we also have car design and gaming design. And, you know, I love Albers and Itten, but even when I was in school back in the 90s, like it's from the 60s, right? 40s to the 60s. It's a very specific, theoretical, abstract way of thinking about color. And a lot of people, I mean, if you're going into rock video design, right? Maybe you want to see images of how color applies in terms of a video still, right? So we have all of these disciplines. I thought, well, wouldn't it be great to write a color theory book that talks about the concepts and has all the ITN type charts, right? Tints and tones and shade charts, but also had an example of analogous color palettes for each of the majors. And so I'll share one page. I scanned one page just sort of to show you the idea here. So this was a page from the chapter of local versus symbolic. So local being the colors that world looks like. Symbolic means sort of hyper color to evoke an emotional response or some psychological state. So, you know, we talk about on this page graphic design and then advertising, and then allowing to compare and contrast and develop meaning through that. And of course, if you're looking at an ITN square, right, and you're going into advertising, for a modern student, I thought there was a bit of a disconnect there. So that's why I wrote this book.
No, that's wonderful. And I was just thinking about the kind of department differentiation where you're working yourself in this kind of hybrid. But now that I know a little bit more about the school and how color can be applied to these like really specific disciplines, that's so valuable and so useful. So thank you for sharing that with us. Aralia, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about color in your work, specifically expanding on it into thinking about food, because your work, you talk about this kind of like synthetic color and the kind of cravings for it, but you also talk about visual appetites. Can you tell us a little bit about food in relation to your work?
Yeah, so part of the master's research I was doing at NASCAD, I wrote my thesis on the relationship between color and food and color and painting, because I think there's a lot of crossovers that happen. A lot of the foods that we buy in the grocery store are colored, whether it be fruit, vegetables, meat, eggs, as well as like the processed things that you would expect, like candy or pop. They all have color added to them to make them more appealing to us. And I decided to kind of play with that in my painting as well by like amping up the colors and testing out like which colors are making us more hungry, what's evoking what. And my final project was called Taste Test. So I was kind of playing with blurring the lines between how shapes and colors could read as like savory or sweet or chemical or organic, like blurring what our expectations are. And yeah, I hope that I was able to pull it off.
Yeah, absolutely. And for anyone who wants to see a little bit more of Aralia's work, I put a link in the chat to your website so we can take a look at your delicious paintings and sculptures. We've got about 5 minutes before I open it up to questions. I'm trying to think of like if there's what in particular I want to end on in our chat. Do you either of you have any advice for students who might be interested in experimenting with paint three-dimensionally in the way you both have found a practice in, or in creating these kind of hybrid forms of work?
Yeah, I have a couple of pieces of advice.
Yeah.
I would say, first off, reach out to your community, like find mentors. If you're interested in a different way of working, find experts that will help you. Two, just play and experiment. And three, don't worry about style. I have explored a lot of different ways of making and a lot of different kind of visual styles throughout my art career. And it was kind of scary to be bouncing around and completely shifting what I was doing. but at the end of the day, like you can see my hand throughout all of it, and it all makes sense with time. Looking back, it all makes sense now. In the moment, it was kind of scary to jump from like digital collage to oil painting to sculptural acrylic. But with time, it all makes sense. So just play and put in the time, talk to the people that you need to, build your network in your community. That's my advice.
Trust the process.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks, Aralia. Chris, what about you? Any advice for students or people interested in expanding their practice in this way?
Yeah, I mean, all of what Aurelia said sounds good. I guess you got to know yourself, what type of artist you are. So, I have artist friends that do not like to play in their practice. And so if they're trying to do something like this, maybe it's the wrong thing, right? So knowing what play is and experiencing what's called now flow. So meaning you just sort of lose yourself in that play, and always to be humble, because even if you've been doing it for years, the paint will always want to do what it wants to do. Like if it's 5 degrees hotter in the studio, it will do something different than the day before. Also to realize that things take many years to sort of perfect. So you're probably not going to hit exactly what you want right away, but to think of the long game. And like Aurelia said, like over time, all of these things make sense. So don't beat yourself up. But I guess at the same time, at least for me, I have my unofficial stuff and then my official stuff. Because at a certain point, like you want to exhibit, and you'll graduate if you're a student, and you want to show, and maybe you want a commercial career, maybe you don't. But there's nothing wrong with having sort of an official thing you do. And a gallery showing is great, because then you can do 10 of those things and then really fine tune the concept, but then have like your unofficial stuff on the back burner that you're playing with. And you don't even have to show anybody that. And that might prove dividends in, 5-10 years down the road.
Yeah, I love what you're saying about play, and I think that that's really good advice, because there are, as you all know, there's always deadlines, or there's always upcoming projects, and there's always things we're kind of building towards, and things we have to do to accomplish goals. But and often the studio time gets absorbed into that. But I think it's very, very good advice to remind us all that studio time also has to be play. It has to be without agenda in that way. Well, let's open it up to some questions. And if anybody wants to pop into the chat or wants to turn on their camera and ask Chris and Aurelia questions, now is the time.
I just want to say that a few years ago, I attended a talk that Temple Grandin gave at the in Truro at the Agricultural College. And one of the things that she stressed was tinkering, that it was so essential. And that's where ideas came from. And that people have to get off of their computer screens or whatever, though she admitted that there's a lot of benefits to that, but that you have to tinker. And I've just thought, wow, thank you, Temple. She said it. And that's what you guys do. You tinker, you play, or you tinker.
Well, you were one who taught me that too. It's the fine tuning of an idea. Like has anyone seen Oppenheimer?
Not yet.
Yeah, well, everyone knows the idea of making an atomic bomb, right? And it's such an interesting thing that they made this thing in such short of a time. But it's because they had like thousands of people and brain power doing this. But as artists, we're just one person figuring this out. And we have our contact people and that too. But my impulse, even after doing this for years, is to give up. And it's like, hey, wait a minute. It's not about giving up, it's about tinkering.
Yeah.
And so I always remember that now. If I'm having a problem, it doesn't mean you change course. You just change like a little degree of something, and it might prove to be something explosive. I guess that's a bad metaphor, but yeah, it's very true.
Yeah, and I think that we've kind of touched on idea or conversations about technology and screens, and AI is such a big conversation point these days. But when it comes back to painting and sculpture, like, it is material, it is embodied. You kind of just have to be present in the studio and just experimenting and playing around and seeing what happens. You can't expect something instantaneous to happen.
Exactly. And I think that's why painting is still relevant and why people still enjoy it, and why it's probably going to be still maybe even more valued in the future, because it is this handmade thing. It can go beyond the image. And I think that's what I'm trying to do, is bring it back from just this Instagram image. I sort of knew that's where it was going 30 years ago. And I mean, we're there now, right? I mean, and this conversation's so refreshing, because my work tends to not even be thought of as painting, because people just think painting is image, and it's not at all. I want to do a textbook where all of the paintings are photographed as objects, like from a bit of an angle with the frame and on the wall. I mean, communing with artwork is a totally different thing in person. I like the idea of communing rather than looking at an image. Yeah, I mean, that's
Yeah.
the underpinnings of why I do what I do.
In the same way, I do find this really refreshing conversation as well, because I often get placed in the box of purely sculpture, which is fine. I'm happy to be called a sculptor, but I think that there's something that you lose. Like, I feel that my origins are painting, and my understanding of art making comes from painting. And to consider the whole ecosystem of art making that both of us are engaging in, if you just limit it to one area, that's doing it a disservice, I think.
Yeah. And I mean, there's such a historical sort of precedence, which I guess tends to be forgotten along the way, like thinking of Gainsborough's lantern paintings and Pinkham Ryder's paintings with these surfaces, even though they're 200 years old now, they're still drying. And there is this idea of, well, there is an ephemeral quality. And of course, at least in Western art, it has always been about being around for a long time on the walls. And I freely admit my work probably won't be. That's why the photograph of my work, I spend more time on it than I used to in the past, because it's a documentation of something that is quite ephemeral. And on the commercial market, you know, I'm constantly having to do repairs. But that's okay, you know, and this isn't a new thing we're doing. It just isn't recognized like it should be, I think.
Aralia, do you think about ephemerality or conservation when it comes to your work as well?
Yeah, I do, because the nature of my work is the process I've set up for myself. My paintings could continue to grow forever. I'm piping on paint, they're growing, they're mutating. So I've been trying to make more of an effort recently to document my work throughout the stages of production, because as long as they're with me, I can't help myself but continue to build and let them grow and become what they want to become. But then once they hit the gallery, they're kind of frozen in that moment. So I find that photography helps me document. In terms of like archivalness, they are delicate, but I find that they're no more delicate than like a painting on canvas. There's special considerations I take, but I feel pretty confident about their archival quality out in the world.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if the material becomes more precarious when it's done in that three-dimensional or in that kind of like thickness. So it's good to hear.
I do have special considerations I take, but I think that every artist has those kind of considerations that yeah.
Well, I was at the MoMA a year ago, and I'm standing in front of an Amsel Kiefer, and this huge chunk just fell off. And in 30 seconds, this little cart with two conservators came, and they had all their glues and scissors, and they and put it back up. And I asked them, I said, you know, because you think as an artist, oh my God, only my work's falling apart. Everyone else knows what they're doing, right? And that's not the case. With modern materials, there is this level of vulnerability, and the galleries expect that. You know, yeah, with my work, you just don't want like a sharp knife with the monofilament. But other than that, you know, if they follow the procedure to pack it, then it's fine. Um, yeah, I mean, I know artists who just paint on canvas who are always fixing their work in clients' homes too. You know, a stray elbow or, you know, a cat with the claws can do just as much damage. But we're making physical objects in a physical world, and, you know, I mean, nothing lasts forever, really. So, yeah, that's all part of it. That's part of the
Yeah,
beauty
that's
of
an
it.
exciting moment for me is I never know what the artwork's going to end up like, and it's going to go live its own life with or without me. And I can continue to edit it if I choose to.
Yeah, that mutation kind of continues without your intervention, right? As you're talking about
Mhm.
like the choices you get to make on editing or building on the work, but yeah, there is like a certain level of control that gets shifted when it goes into the gallery or goes into a home, and the way it continues to change in its own terms.
Ooh, I don't know.
I don't
Well,
know, I'm trying to
I would say just for my work, you know, we're talking about painting and working sculpturally with it, and I'm not averse to all of the detritus around it becoming work in and of itself. So I'll just show you like what I mean by that. All of my work has depended on making maquettes. So
Mm,
I'll just show you one here. So this is a piece I did. I recreated my parents' living room out of paint blobs a while back, and this was the maquette I made for it. And this sort of started me working with just school grade foam core. I glue it together and then I carve the form out of it. And then I can take it apart and I have templates. So nothing I do is actually gestural. It's all highly planned. And I guess that's what I meant by an engineering brain. That's where it, what I have for sure. And so these are made with these little figure maquettes that I carve. But I have so many now that one body of work that's come from it is this, where I've been photographing them and then displaying the prints of them. So this sort of ties into this idea of this monastic practice that I have of carving and sort of being a nomad through my computer. I find all my imagery now online, and sort of muting individuality too. So the idea that they're all out of this sort of death-like foam core. It's like snow, muting the meaning. And here's two close-ups. So this is a man rescuing dog during Hurricane Harvey, 2007. And this is Naomi Osaka, eliminated during Olympics Tokyo 2020. So again, like I work with something very specific, the found event, but then it sort of loses itself in the material. And as people get older, they forget the reference. And I think that's what all of my work is about. It's just this sort of fading away. You know, it disintegrates, it disperses, the paint strokes eventually disperse, and they disperse the subject, but they'll also, over time, probably just break down and disperse on their own too.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that one way that our work diverges a bit Chris, is I lean into the gesture and the labor of the making. And I entered this way of working through exploring food aesthetics, but more and more I've been leaning into abstraction and building these kind of mutant evolutions that are more fractal-like, and they become more and more strange. So we diverge, but then we could meet again with this this loss of reference, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's that play, like it's paint, but it's like in my case, it's paint, but it's a sculpture, but it's a photograph. You know, what exactly is it? In your case, it's paint, it's food, it's sculpture. You know, I enjoy that hybrid quality to working this way.
Do you find that like there's a very kind of clear like tactility to your work? Do you find that people are like drawn to touching it, or that they're afraid to touch it because it seems precious? Or how do you find that viewers kind of engage with the materiality of your work, or have you found that?
I find that people really want to touch my work, and that's challenging in the gallery setting. If they're in my studio and I make sure they've washed their hands and they've been given the approval, it's allowed, but it is a challenge. Even when I had my graduate show at NASCAD, several profs told me they wouldn't be bringing their children by because they were worried that they would try and play with the artwork. But I think that that's such a compliment, because just to be able to evoke that kind of a response where you just like need to get up there and like interact with something, I think that that's so special. Although I would not recommend it in the gallery setting.
Yeah, I mean, kids are the enemy. Even I have a 6-year-old, so it's like if my work is hung up high, I'm okay. Some of the work isn't, and I know my dealer at one showing stood there gruffly warding off all the children. They're if we're affecting their senses that much, I mean, it has to be a good thing. And I expect people to lean in and put their glasses on at an opening. And it's just like, I used to get stressed about it, and I don't anymore, because I'm not thinking of these pieces as anything more than an event, you know, like it's an event for people to see at that moment. I have the photo. Again, like the photos have become more meaningful to me, the documentation. If the thing gets broken in transit, I have the photo to prove I did it and to show what it is. And like Aralia said, the process shots have become more important as the years go on too.
Yeah, I think it's so special when I have an exhibition and there is that impulse for people to want to like touch or like figure out what it's made of, and to see people physically moving their body around to see all angles of a work, I think is so special, because far too often you see people interacting with painting shows where they just kind of walk around the room and then exit. So I take it as such a compliment if they're like moving their bodies around and physically having to engage to see what's going on.
There's one question in the chat I just want to bring up before we close, but James Fowler has said, both artists spoke about historical processes and materials that inform their work. Are there new technologies or tools impacting the way each artist is making art? And if so, in what ways? This seems relevant to what you were saying about photography, Chris, but is there anything else that you want to tell us about before we sign off for today in terms of technology in your work?
Oh yeah, I'm not averse to technology. You know, one question people have is, so I was doing my stasis figures before you could scan a human body. And now you can scan a human body, right? So people sometimes ask me, well, why don't you just scan a human body? And the answer is, I don't want to. And there's also many aesthetic decisions along the way that I make that it would look different. So everyone knows this as a painter. If you paint from a portrait from real life, it will look different than painting from a photo. There's an integrity to how you approach something. So I don't want to do that because it is about paint for me, but I love my computer. So if I find an image of somebody online that I want to translate, I use the computer to snatch the image. I use my camera. I have a little doll that I photograph in the same pose from all 4 angles. And then I feed that into the computer, and I just lay them out on the same grid line. And then I physically carve it, looking at the image on the computer. Suzanne Gauthier taught me that, if you're using an image, make it as big as you can. In those days, we were making big photocopies, like don't lose anything in translation. Nowadays, I look at my computer screen when I'm carving, because it's just a really clear image of the figure. So I fold in new technologies. I'm also dialoguing with how the economic structures of technologies, like in the Sun Valley reference, how that affects our understanding of reality. So yeah, I'm all for building it in when it underpins what I want to say.
Yeah, and I would say for me, my main focus and priority is thinking about paint as a material and being present in the studio. But I also do engage with photography, and I have done some collaborations with digital media artists where they've scanned my paintings and then placed them in virtual reality worlds. So that was really fun because then I could take my paintings, which generally are quite small, and they could scale them up to monumental sizes. And then viewers in this virtual world could walk around and my paintings would be as large as mountains. So I think that that's really exciting, but that's not my personal skill set. So to work in that way, I would have to have collaborations.
Well, thank you guys so much. It was such a pleasure to chat with both of you. For everyone watching, as I said, you can find more about Aralia and Chris in the group chat or in the meeting chat. Thank you to everyone who's joined for artwork this year. We'll have more in the new year. Stay tuned. And thanks again, Chris and Aralia.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Molly.
Yeah, thanks, Molly. Thanks everybody for coming.
Yeah,
Good
thank you.
conversation.